Think medieval nunneries, where all peace and quiet. Think again. What if centuries ago, these holy places faced financial disasters so epic they almost wiped them out? Get ready to uncover 5 forgotten financial crises that nearly destroyed medieval nunneries from the 11th to the 15th centuries. Number 5. The Black Death strikes the Abbey of St. Clare. The year is 1348, and the Abbey of St. Clare sits nestled in the green rolling lands of East Anglia, England. For generations, this nunnery, dedicated to the contemplative life, had enjoyed a steady, if modest, prosperity. Its stone walls enclosed quiet cloisters, a beautiful chapel and dormitories where Benedictine nuns lived lives devoted to prayer and scholarly pursuits. Their wealth, like most medieval institutions, was tied to the land. They owned vast stretches of farmland, forests, and meadows, which were rented out to local peasants and farmers. These tenants paid their rents in coin, or sometimes in shares of their harvest, or even by providing labor on the abbey's own fields. Donations from local gentry families, who often sent their daughters to join the community, also provided a vital income stream. A steady trickle of offerings from pilgrims visiting the abbey's modest collection of relics helped too. The cellarer, Sister Agnes, a stern but fair woman, kept meticulous records of every penny spent and every loaf of bread baked. For years, the abbey's accounts, meticulously scrolled on parchment, showed a slow but steady accumulation of resources, enough to keep the buildings in good repair, the refectory well stocked, and the oil lamps burning brightly in the scriptorium late into the night. Then came the rumor, whispers of a terrible sickness spreading across Europe, leaving death and desolation in its wake. First they seemed distant, like stories from a far-off land. But then the whispers grew louder, closer. They spoke of villages emptied, of fields untended, of market towns hushed and still. By the spring of 1349, the dread reality reached East Anglia. The Black Death, a plague unlike any known before, descended with terrifying speed. It began in the small village of Elmwood, just a few miles from the abbey gates. Soon the news arrived that entire families had vanished, their houses shuttered, their livestock wandering aimlessly. First casualty in the abbey's sphere was old Thomas, one of their most reliable tenant farmers, a man whose family had worked abbey land for 4 generations. He died swiftly, followed by his wife and 2 of his children. Tragedy was heartbreaking, but it was also a harbinger of the financial ruin that would soon engulf St. Clare's. The impact on the abbey's finances was immediate and brutal. With their tenants succumbing to the plague, the rents simply stopped. Parchment rolls in Sister Agnes's office, once filled with neat rows of payments, now showed an ever-growing list of arrears. Lands that had once been meticulously cultivated lay fallow, choked by weeds. There was simply no one left to work them. The few surviving peasants were too terrified or too weak to manage the fields. The harvests plummeted, meaning less grain for the abbey's own consumption, and nothing to sell at market for coin. The traditional system of income, built on centuries of agricultural stability, crumbled in a matter of months. A severe labor shortage crippled every aspect of the abbey's operations. Before the plague, a small army of lay brothers and hired laborers performed the heavy work, tilling fields, tending livestock, hauling wood, and maintaining the sprawling abbey complex. Now, these men were gone, victims of the plague or having fled in terror. The nuns, whose lives were typically devoted to spiritual tasks, found themselves faced with an impossible burden. They had to take on tasks they were never trained for, struggling to milk cows, mend fences, and even attempt to gather what little harvest remained. The beautiful gardens, once a source of fresh vegetables and medicinal herbs, became overgrown and wild. The scarcity of goods and labor led to rampant inflation, a financial shockwave that hit the abbey just as its income evaporated. The price of essential commodities skyrocketed. A sack of flour, once a manageable expense, now cost 3 times as much. Candles, vital for illuminating the chapel and dormitories, became a luxury. Firewood, essential for warmth in the cold English winters, was almost impossible to find at any price. The few surviving merchants, seeing an opportunity in the widespread misery, hoarded goods and charged exorbitant fees. Sister Agnes, who had always prided herself on her shrewd bargaining, found herself paying outrageous sums for even the most basic necessities, watching the abbey's dwindling cash reserves drain away like water from a sieve. Repairs to the ancient buildings, always a continuous need, became impossible. The roof of the guest house began to leak, its timbers rotting. But there were no skilled carpenters left, and certainly no money to pay them if they could be found. The loss of life within the abbey walls, though initially less severe than in the villages, also took its toll. While the nuns initially practiced strict quarantine, the plague eventually breached their defenses. 4 nuns, including the elderly sub-prioress, fell ill and died, their passing leaving a void in the community. More critically, for the abbey's future, the flow of new recruits dried up. Families who had traditionally sent their younger daughters to St. Clare's for education, or as an act of piety, were now decimated themselves. The few surviving families clung desperately to their remaining children. The concept of offering a daughter to God, once a sign of devotion and status, became a luxury few could afford or were willing to consider in such desperate times. The once vibrant novice mistress, Sister Mary, found her days empty, the novice cells silent. This meant a long-term decline in the number of nuns, impacting their ability to maintain the extensive daily offices and care for the complex. Perhaps most devastating for the long-term financial health of the abbey was the sudden disappearance of their patrons. Noble families, who had for centuries endowed the abbey with lands, money, and valuable gifts in exchange for prayers for their souls, were often hit even harder by the plague than the common folk. Their urban residences, crowded and unsanitary, were breeding grounds for the disease. Whole lineages were wiped out, their titles and lands passing to distant, often indifferent relatives. The generous annuities and periodic gifts that had supplemented the abbey's income simply ceased. The abbey's Liber Benefactorum, the Book of Benefactors, a testament to centuries of pious generosity, now read like a necrology, filled with the names of the recently departed, their legacies unfinished, their promised donations unfulfilled. The future looked bleak, stripped of both the daily income from their lands and the crucial infusions of wealth from their traditional supporters. The nuns of St. Clare's faced unimaginable struggles. Hunger became a constant companion. The refectory, once filled with the muted clatter of bowls and quiet chatter, grew quiet, the portions smaller, the food coarser. Their diet, once varied with garden vegetables and occasional meat, became monotonous, relying heavily on dried peas and stale bread. Cold permeated the ancient stones of the abbey in winter, as fuel became scarce. Precious illuminated manuscripts in the scriptorium, once cared for with reverence, were left to gather dust as the nuns focused on sheer survival. The physical labor was grueling. Sister Agnes, the cellarer, once solely responsible for accounts and provisioning, now spent her mornings in the muddy fields, attempting to direct the few remaining exhausted laborers. Her hands, once soft from years of holding quill pens, now calloused and cracked. Sister Elizabeth, the infirmarian, battled not only lingering illnesses but also the desperate lack of medicinal herbs and remedies, many of which she usually grew in the now overgrown garden. In a desperate bid to survive, the abbess, Mother Superior Eleanor, a woman who had previously guided the abbey through years of peaceful administration, was forced to make agonizing decisions. The first to go were the non-essential silver items, chalices and patens not strictly necessary for the daily mass, decorative crosses, and ornamental plates used for feasts that no longer occurred. These were carefully weighed and sold to local merchants, often at rock-bottom prices, in exchange for coin that bought a few more sacks of grain or a small measure of lamp oil. According to the Liber Vitae of St. Clare's Abbey, entries for the year 1349, it records the reluctant sale of the great silver chalice, gifted by Lord de Lacy in 1280, weighing 12 marks for 5 pounds of silver, a sum that provided only a temporary reprieve. The nuns watched heartbroken, as pieces of their spiritual heritage, objects imbued with generations of devotion, were carried away. Next, the abbess considered the abbey's most precious possessions, relics. These holy objects, often fragments of saints' bones or pieces of their clothing, were not just spiritual treasures, but also held significant financial value. Pilgrims came to venerate them, bringing offering. Selling them was almost unthinkable, an act of desperation that verged on sacrilege. Yet the choice was between losing their souls or losing their very existence. Archival fragments from the Norwich Consistory Court, dating to 1351, reveal a petition from Abbess Eleanor requesting special dispensation from the bishop to alienate certain venerated relics for the preservation of the community, which faces utter destitution from the pestilence. Whether the sale of any relics actually occurred is unclear from the surviving records, but the mere request speaks volumes about the depth of their desperation. The abbey also attempted to mortgage or pawn parts of their remaining property. Small parcels of land that still had a few working tenants were offered as collateral to wealthy urban merchants or moneylenders. These transactions were perilous. The interest rates were often exorbitant, and the risk of losing the land permanently was high. Some of these debts were recorded in the fragmentary account rolls of the Abbey of St. Clare, which show entries like "Loan received from Master John of Norwich, £10, against the Manor of Littleford, annual interest 20%. Such agreements were a last resort, a desperate gamble against the chance of recovery. The nuns also had to swallow their pride and send out sisters, sometimes even the abbess herself, to beg for alms from any noble family who had survived and still held some wealth. This was a departure from their usual dignified existence, a public display of their acute need. The Black Death left St. Clare's Abbey utterly transformed. The once bustling agricultural enterprise was crippled. Their numbers dwindled, and the daily rhythm of their lives was irrevocably altered by hunger, cold, and ceaseless physical labor. The magnificent buildings began to show their age unrepaired and neglected. Their spiritual treasures were diminished, their future uncertain. The Black Death was not just a medical catastrophe. For the Abbey of St. Clare and countless other medieval institutions, it was a financial cataclysm that pushed them to the brink of utter collapse, forcing them to shed centuries of tradition and privilege just to survive another day. Number 4. The endless wars and raids on the Priory of Sainte Marie. For centuries, the Priory of Sainte Marie stood proudly on a hill overlooking the river Loire in France. Its founding in the early 12th century had been an act of piety by a powerful local lord, Count Bertrand of Anjou, who had endowed it with extensive lands and privileges. The nuns of Sainte Marie, followers of the Cistercian order, were known for their strict adherence to their rule and their industriousness. They were largely self-sufficient, managing their vast estates with efficiency. Their income came from the grain they harvested from their fields, the wool from their sheep, the wine from their vineyards, and the tolls collected from a bridge they owned across the river. They also received regular payments and gifts from the descendants of Count Bertrand and other local nobility who saw the priory as a spiritual bulwark in their territory. Prioress, Mother Isabel, a woman of sharp intellect and even sharper business acumen, ensured that the priory's coffers were always reasonably full, allowing for new construction, the acquisition of rare books, and a comfortable if austere life for her sisters. Then came the 100 Years' War. Not a single continuous conflict, but a series of brutal, intermittent clashes between England and France that dragged on for over a century. For Sainte Marie, located in a region often caught in the crossfire, this era became a living nightmare of financial devastation. The first major blow came in 1356, after the Battle of Poitiers, when English forces, victorious and emboldened, began to fan out across the French countryside. They weren't interested in pitched battles. They were interested in plunder. A detachment of English soldiers, known as rodiers, or free companies, essentially mercenaries operating independently, descended on Sainte Marie without warning. They weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for food, valuables, and ransoms. Their arrival shattered the peaceful rhythm of monastic life. The immediate impact of such raids was catastrophic. The soldiers, under the guise of foraging, stripped the priory bare. They slaughtered the livestock, trampled the vineyards, and burned the barns filled with the recent harvest. What they couldn't consume or carry off, they destroyed. The very fields that produced the priory's income were laid waste, their topsoil churned to mud by horses and human feet. The immediate loss of food meant the nuns faced starvation within weeks. The long-term loss of productive capacity, the inability to harvest or plant new crops, meant years of poverty stretched out before them. As recorded in the Annales de Sainte Marie, entries for 1356, it laments the despoiling of our granaries and cellars, leaving us naught but dust and despair. Our flocks, dispersed or butchered, and the vines which have nourished us for generations, now lie ruined. Beyond direct destruction, the constant threat of further raids forced the nuns to invest heavily in fortifications. Priory, originally built with spiritual peace in mind, had thin walls and no defensive towers. Now Mother Isabel had to divert precious resources, money, labor, materials, to build defensive earthworks, strengthen gates, and even erect a small watchtower. This was a massive, unplanned expense that produced no income and only drained their reserves. Carpenters and masons who demanded high wages due to the constant demand for their skills in a war-torn land had to be hired. The stones, usually earmarked for repairing the chapel roof, went into building crude barricades. This constant need for defense became a significant drain on their finances, diverting funds from essential maintenance and charity. But perhaps the most insidious financial threat was ransom. Commanders of these roving bands of soldiers knew that religious houses, despite their vows of poverty, often held hidden treasures or could raise money from sympathetic patrons. They would capture prominent members of the community, sometimes even the prioress herself, and demand a hefty sum for their release. In 1360, during another particularly violent phase of the war, Mother Isabel was seized by a Gascon company allied with the English. The ransom demanded was enormous. 500 gold florins, a sum equivalent to several years of the priory's normal income. To raise this money, the nuns had to make agonizing choices. They melted down the great silver cross that adorned the altar, a gift from the founding count. They sold off their most precious illuminated manuscripts, some dating back to the priory's earliest days, to wealthy Florentine merchants who traveled with the armies. Priory's jewels, often donated by noblewomen who became nuns, were pawned to Jewish moneylenders in Tours at exorbitant interest rates. As documented in a surviving letter from the Bishop of Orleans to the King's Chancellor, dated 1360, it details the grievous burdens laid upon the humble sisters of Sainte Marie, who have been compelled to divest themselves of their sacred vessels and ancestral treasures to satisfy the brigands. Priory survived. Mother Isabel was returned, but their spiritual and material wealth was irrevocably diminished. The constant warfare also caused a complete disruption of trade routes. The Loire River once a vital artery for transporting their wine and grain to market, became perilous, infested with river pirates and constantly under the threat of passing armies. Roads were unsafe, infested with bandits and straggling soldiers. This meant the priory could no longer sell its surplus produce. Their wine, their most valuable export, often spoiled in storage because it couldn't reach buyers. Goods they needed, like salt, iron tools, and fine cloth, became scarce and incredibly expensive. The economic ecosystem they relied upon was shattered. The regional economy collapsed, affecting their tenants, who now had no market for their own crops and thus could not pay their rents. Many tenants simply fled the region, abandoning their lands to seek safety elsewhere, further reducing the priory's already meager income. The shifting loyalties of local patrons during these turbulent times added another layer of financial instability. Some noble families, caught between English and French allegiances, found their own fortunes plummeting, rendering them unable to continue their support. Others, fearing reprisals from whichever side was currently dominant, simply withdrew their patronage. Priory's spiritual services, once highly valued, seemed less important when survival was the only goal. As noted by Professor Henri Dubois in his extensive work The 100 Years' War and French Monasticism, many religious houses found their endowments drying up as the old feudal order fractured and noble houses either disappeared or turned their attention to military concerns rather than pious donations. The stream of novices also slowed to a trickle as families were unwilling or unable to send their daughters into such an uncertain and dangerous existence. Even when the armies moved on, the legacy of warfare continued to drain the priory's finances. Fields needed to be reseeded, but there was no money for seed grain or new plows. Buildings needed extensive repairs, but there were no skilled craftsmen and no funds to hire them. The livestock had to be replaced, but herds were expensive. The priory was in a constant state of rebuilding, a slow, painful process of recovering from destruction, only to face the threat of another raid. The nuns lived under a perpetual cloud of anxiety, never knowing when the next detachment of soldiers would appear on the horizon, demanding provisions or ransom. Their lives became a cycle of prayer, struggle, and unending financial anxiety, a stark contrast to the stable, prosperous existence their predecessors had known. The 100 Years' War did not just devastate the countryside. It systematically dismantled the financial foundations of institutions like Saint-Marie, leaving them permanently scarred by the ceaseless demands of conflict. Number 3. Papal taxation and the Great Western Schism. The Abbey of St. Ursula, nestled high in the mountainous regions of Bavaria, had long enjoyed a reputation for spiritual purity and a certain degree of independence. Founded in the 11th century by a Saxon duke, it operated under a direct papal exemption, meaning it answered primarily to the Pope himself rather than the local bishop. This privilege, while prestigious, also meant St. Ursula was directly exposed to the financial demands emanating from Rome. The abbey's income, though not enormous, was steady. It came from revenues from its alpine pastures, timber from its vast forests, and small iron mines in the surrounding hills. Additionally, pious donations from pilgrims traveling through the alpine passes and gifts from German noble families provided a comfortable cushion. The abbess, Mother Hildegard, prided herself on the abbey's solvency, ensuring that the sisters lived well and that the library, a source of great pride, continued to acquire rare texts. However, from the late 13th century onwards, the financial landscape for religious houses like St. Ursula began to shift dramatically. Papacy, increasingly centralized and engaged in larger political struggles across Europe, developed a voracious appetite for funds. Pope after pope sought to finance crusades, maintain elaborate courts, and engage in costly wars, often against secular rulers. They looked to the vast wealth of the church itself to supply these needs. One of the primary methods was direct taxation on monastic institutions. This wasn't just occasional offerings. It was a systematic imposition of levies. The most notorious was the decima, or tithe, a tenth of all ecclesiastical income, initially levied for specific crusades, but later becoming a more regular demand. Records from the papal registars of Boniface VIII, dating to the late 13th and early 14th centuries, show numerous demands for these decima payments from monastic houses across Europe, including remote ones like St. Ursula. For St. Ursula, these papal demands were a constant financial drain, even if the abbey's income was primarily in kind: timber, iron ore, cheese. The papal tax collectors demanded payment in hard coin, which was often scarce in their remote location. This forced the abbess to sell off valuable goods or agricultural produce at unfavorable prices to obtain the necessary currency. The collection process itself was often corrupt, with papal legates and their agents demanding additional fees and bribes, further eroding the abbey's resources. The sisters felt a growing resentment as their hard-earned wealth, meant for the upkeep of their spiritual home and the care of the poor, was siphoned away to distant Rome for purposes they barely understood. Then, in 1378, disaster struck in the form of the Great Western Schism. For nearly 40 years, the Catholic Church was split with two, and at one point even three, rival popes, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. One pope resided in Rome, the other in Avignon, France. This division plunged all of Christendom into confusion and chaos, and it unleashed an unprecedented financial crisis upon institutions like St. Ursula. Because the abbey had direct papal exemption, it was now caught in an impossible bind. Both popes demanded allegiance and, crucially, financial support. Each considered the other an anti-pope, and any payments made to the rival was seen as an act of treason. The nuns of St. Ursula, deeply pious, found themselves torn. To whom did their loyalty and their money truly belong? Ignoring one pope meant risking excommunication and eternal damnation. Paying both meant financial ruin. The pressure from both papal curios was relentless. Collectors from Avignon arrived, demanding their due, waving papal bulls and threatening interdict. Soon after, envoys from Rome appeared, making identical demands. Each denounced the other, muddying the waters of spiritual authority and legitimacy. The abbess, Mother Hildegard, found herself navigating a perilous political and spiritual minefield. Her accounts, typically straightforward, became a nightmarish tangle of conflicting demands and desperately sought compromises. Chronicle of St. Ursula Abbey, though sparse during this period, records the arrival of two sets of envoys, one from Rome, the other from Avignon, each demanding our tithes, placing us in a most grievous dilemma. The result was a double taxation, or worse. Some monastic houses attempted to pay only one, hoping to avoid punishment from the other. This was a gamble, as the fortunes of the rival popes waxed and waned. St. Ursula, fearing divine wrath, tried to appease both, if only partially. This meant their already strained finances were bled dry by two sets of tax collectors. The flow of pilgrims, a source of income, also dwindled. With such deep divisions at the heart of the church, many ordinary faithful were hesitant to go on pilgrimages, uncertain which shrines were truly blessed or which masses were truly valid. The spiritual uncertainty directly translated into a tangible loss of income for the abbey. Moreover, the schism empowered local secular rulers and bishops. With papal authority weakened and fractured, many saw an opportunity to assert their own power and claim a share of the church's wealth. The local duke, who had always respected St. Ursula's papal exemption, now began to levy his own emergency taxes on the abbey, arguing that with two popes, who was to say what was truly legitimate? The Bishop of Passau, long resentful of the abbey's independent status, began to demand traditional episcopal dues that had previously been waived. The abbey was caught in a multi-front financial assault, with their traditional protectors either powerless or themselves demanding money. To cope, the nuns of St. Ursula were forced into desperate measures. They curtailed all new acquisitions for their beloved library, once a point of pride. Repairs to the abbey church, which suffered from chronic damp, were postponed indefinitely, leading to structural problems that would cost far more to fix later. Their hospitality, once generous to travelers and the poor, became severely restricted. Quality of their food declined, and the sisters, known for their robust health, began to suffer from malnutrition. The iron mines, once a steady source of income, had to be sold off to a local noble at a significant discount, simply to raise enough coin to satisfy a particularly pressing papal demand. This was a direct divestment of their core assets, a permanent loss of a stable revenue stream. Professor Anton Müller, in his work The Bavarian Church and the Avignon Papacy, highlights that many smaller monastic houses were forced to sell off valuable endowments during the schism, leading to their long-term impoverishment. The abbess, Mother Hildegard, found herself having to borrow money from local merchants and even Jewish lenders, often at extortionate rates, just to meet the tax demands. The abbey, once debt-free, became burdened with heavy interest payments, further eroding its remaining resources. These loans were often secured against future income, or even against precious items from the sacristy. The schism did not just cause theological strife. It created an unprecedented financial drain on the monastic houses of Europe, leaving St. Ursula Abbey impoverished, indebted, and profoundly shaken by the crisis of authority and the relentless demands for money from every quarter. It was a crisis born not of natural disaster or war, but of internal church politics and the insatiable financial appetites of rival pontiffs. Number 2. The abbatial mismanagement of the Convent of the Holy Sepulchre. The Convent of the Holy Sepulchre, a community of Augustinian canonesses located near Bristol in England, had a long and somewhat checkered history. Founded in the late 12th century, it was initially a moderately wealthy house, enjoying revenues from several manors, a profitable mill, and a weekly market charter granted by the king. Convent's fortunes ebbed and flowed with the capabilities of its successive abbesses. For several decades, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, under the shrewd leadership of Abbess Matilda, the convent had thrived. Matilda had invested wisely, expanded their agricultural holdings, and maintained strict financial discipline. The sisters lived comfortably. The buildings were well maintained, and they even had enough surplus to provide significant charity to the local poor. However, a serious financial crisis gripped the convent in the mid-14th century, not due to external forces like plague or war, but from within. It was the result of severe abbatial mismanagement, and some whispered outright corruption. The new abbess, Lady Isabella de Clare, elected in 1340, came from a powerful noble family, but lacked any practical experience in managing a large estate or a complex institution. Her piety was unquestionable, but her understanding of finance was practically non-existent. She was easily swayed by flatterers and less than scrupulous advisors. Her reign, lasting for over 2 decades, became a slow, agonizing descent into financial ruin for the convent. One of Abbess Isabella's major failings was her excessive generosity and hospitality. Raised in a lavish household, she felt it was fitting for a convent of their standing to entertain important guests in a grand manner. This meant elaborate feasts, expensive wines, and costly gifts for visiting prelates, nobles, and royal officials. Where Abbess Matilda had offered simple, wholesome fare, Isabella ordered imported spices, fine meats, and rare delicacies. The kitchen accounts, meticulously kept by Sister Eleanor, the cook began to show alarming increases in expenditure. The Bristol Episcopal Registries, specifically visitations to religious houses around 1355, contain notes from the bishop's commissary admonishing the abbess for undue extravagance in feasting and entertainment, to the detriment of the house's coffers. These frequent and expensive entertainments quickly drained the convent's liquid assets. Another critical error was the abbess's poor management of the convent's agricultural holdings. She appointed stewards and bailiffs based on their family connections or personal charm rather than their competence or honesty. These individuals, often lacking proper oversight, either neglected the lands or, worse, actively embezzled funds. The mill, once a profitable enterprise, fell into disrepair due to neglected maintenance, reducing its output and thus its income. The market charter, which should have provided steady tolls, was poorly enforced, with many vendors evading payments due to lax supervision. The fields, once meticulously managed, yielded smaller harvests as tenants were not held accountable for their work and new farming methods were ignored. The revenues from their manors plummeted, while the cost of managing them remained high. Convents' income streams, once reliable, became unreliable and diminished. Abbess Isabella also displayed a profound lack of business sense when it came to investments and loans. She would lend money to her noble relatives or favored courtiers, often without proper security and frequently at terms highly unfavorable to the convent. Many of these loans were never repaid, becoming bad debts that further eroded the convent's capital. Conversely, when the convent needed funds, she would borrow at exorbitant interest rates from unscrupulous moneylenders in Bristol, seemingly unaware of the long-term burden these debts would place on the community. The financial accounts of the Holy Sepulchre Convent from the mid-14th century show a rapid accumulation of debt, with payments to Master Isaac the Jew for a loan of £50, bearing 25% interest. This was a staggering sum, and the interest alone was a constant drain. Perhaps the most egregious example of mismanagement was the abbess's tendency to alienate convent property without proper authorization, or for negligible returns. She would grant advantageous leases to her relatives for decades, undercharging for prime land or lucrative rights. Sometimes, she would even sell off small parcels of land or timber rights to raise quick cash, often at prices far below their true value. These actions diminished the convent's patrimony, leaving less land and fewer resources for future generations of nuns. The episcopal visitation records from 1362 explicitly note the alienation of a meadow near Bedminster, valued at 20 shillings per annum for a mere 5 shillings cash, without proper consent of the chapter or bishop. This was a significant violation of monastic law, yet Isabella, through her family connections, often managed to avoid serious consequences. At least initially, the consequences for the convent were severe. The buildings, once well maintained, began to fall into disrepair. The roof of the church leaked during every rainstorm, threatening the precious altar and vestments. Dormitories grew cold and damp, and conditions for the nuns deteriorated significantly. The quality and quantity of food in the refectory declined, forcing the nuns to eat a monotonous diet of coarse bread and watery gruel. Their health suffered. Convent, once able to provide charity to the poor of Bristol, now had little to offer. Their reputation, once solid, began to suffer, making it harder to attract new recruits from respectable families. The number of novices dropped, as families were reluctant to send their daughters to a house known for its financial woes. The nuns themselves were acutely aware of the unfolding disaster. Sister Margaret, the sub-prioress, tried repeatedly to gently advise Abbess Isabella, but her concerns were dismissed. The convent's internal chapter meetings became tense affairs, with murmurs of discontent growing louder. They petitioned the Bishop of Worcester, whose diocese they were in, to intervene. It took years, But eventually, in 1365, after numerous complaints and failed attempts to rectify the situation, the bishop conducted a thorough investigation. The findings were damning. The convent was deep in debt, its assets diminished, and its management utterly chaotic. The bishop, acting on his authority, eventually removed Abbess Isabella from office, a rare and drastic step. The removal of Abbess Isabella did not, however, instantly solve the convent's problems. It was left with a mountain of debt, depleted resources, and a reputation severely tarnished. The new abbess, a pragmatic and pious nun named Sister Joan, faced an uphill battle. She spent years trying to renegotiate loans, recover alienated properties, often unsuccessfully, and restore the convent's financial stability. The Convent of the Holy Sepulchre suffered for decades from Isabella's mismanagement, struggling to regain even a semblance of its former modest prosperity. It was a stark reminder that, even without plague, war, or papal demands, a convent's financial ruin could be self-inflicted, born of poor leadership and a shocking lack of fiscal responsibility. Number 1. The Great Famine and Climate, shipwreck at the Nunnery of St. Anne. High in the uplands of Yorkshire, England, the Nunnery of St. Anne had endured for over 2 centuries. Founded by local Saxon lords, it was a modest community of about 20 Cistercian nuns, known for their austerity and their strong connection to the land. Their income was almost entirely agricultural. They owned extensive sheep flocks, whose wool was sold to merchants in York, and cultivated large fields of oats and barley. They also derived income from a few tenant farms and from the sale of medicinal herbs grown in their walled garden. Prioress Mother Benedicta, a practical woman from a yeoman family, ran the nunnery with a firm but fair hand, ensuring that the harvest was properly stored and that their accounts scratched onto simple wax tablets and later transferred to parchment, balanced each year. Their existence was simple, hardy, and entirely dependent on the bounty of the earth. Then, beginning in 1315, an unseen pervasive force began to exert its terrible pressure, a prolonged and devastating climate shift that led to the Great Famine. This was not a sudden catastrophe like a plague, but a relentless creeping disaster stretching over several years, marked by unprecedented rainfall, failed harvest, and widespread starvation across northern Europe. For St. Anne's, nestled in a region particularly vulnerable to the cold and wet, the impact was catastrophic. The long, brutal winters stretched into equally cold, wet springs. Summers were short and overcast, with incessant rains that waterlogged the fields. The immediate impact was on the harvests. The first year, 1315, the oat and barley crops were meager, barely enough to feed the community, with nothing left over to sell. The incessant rain rotted the standing grain in the fields, and what little could be harvested was damp and quickly molded in storage. The next year, 1316, was even worse. The sowing season was delayed by the saturated ground, and then the young plants were drowned by relentless downpours. The sheep, their main source of wealth, suffered terribly from foot rot and disease in the sodden pastures. Many died, their wool ruined. The surviving sheep were sickly and produced little wool. The annals of the Abbey of St. Anne, though brief for these years, noted simply, "The heavens weep without cease, and our fields yield only despair." The economic consequences for St. Anne's were profound and immediate. Their primary source of income, agricultural produce and wool, simply vanished. With no surplus grain to sell, they had no coin. With no wool, they couldn't pay for the basic necessities they couldn't produce themselves, such as salt, iron for tools, or lamp oil. Prices of what little grain was available in local markets soared to astronomical levels. A measure of wheat that once cost a few pence now demanded a shilling or more, money the nuns simply did not have. Constant rains also ruined the peat they harvested for fuel, leaving the nunnery cold and damp through interminable winters. The nuns, accustomed to hard work, found their labor yielding nothing but frustration and deeper poverty. The widespread famine also meant that their tenant farmers, already living on the margins, faced absolute destitution. Many died of starvation or disease brought on by malnutrition. Those who survived had nothing to pay in rents, whether in coin or in kind. They had no grain, no livestock, and often no strength to work. The land lay untended, once again, not due to plague, but due to human weakness and death by starvation. The customary tithes and offerings from local villagers, already reduced by the Black Death decades earlier, now ceased almost entirely. People themselves were starving and had nothing to give. The lack of fodder for their remaining livestock meant a desperate struggle. The few surviving sheep and cattle became emaciated. Mother Benedicta was forced to sell off many of the animals, not for profit, but simply because she could not feed them. This was a catastrophic loss of capital, as it meant fewer animals to breed in the future, cementing a long-term decline in their wool and dairy production. Communal stores of food, typically enough to last a year, were rapidly depleted. The sisters faced severe hunger. Their diet became monotonous, consisting of whatever meager substandard crops they could salvage, and perhaps occasional forage from the diminishing forest. Their physical health deteriorated. Their prayers, usually a source of comfort, became desperate pleas for an end to the ceaseless rain and the gnawing hunger. To survive, the nuns of St. Anne were forced to resort to truly desperate measures. They began to sell off their most precious assets, items that represented their spiritual legacy and their centuries of dedication. The silver chalice, a gift from the founding Lord, was melted down to purchase a few sacks of grain. The intricately illuminated gospel book, a treasure of their library, was sold to a wealthy merchant in York. These were not easy decisions. They were made in the face of imminent starvation. As recounted by the Chronicle of Famine and Hardship, a fragmented contemporary account found in the archives of York Minster, the Sisters of St. Anne's were driven by the pangs of hunger to alienate their holiest vessels for the price of coarse bread. The nuns also took out loans from local landowners and merchants, pledging future harvests that might never materialize. These loans carried crippling interest rates, creating a debt burden that would plague the nunnery for decades, even after the famine subsided. They sent out sisters to beg for alms in the surrounding villages, a humiliating experience for women accustomed to a dignified, if austere, existence. But the villages themselves were suffering, and there was little to give. Pervasive damp, caused by the endless rains, led to accelerated decay of the nunnery's buildings. The ancient stone walls, already battling the harsh Yorkshire climate, became saturated. Roof timbers rotted, and the chapel floor grew dangerously slippery with moss. Without funds for repairs, the buildings fell into disrepair, making the already difficult living conditions even worse. Quality of the water, a simple well, deteriorated, leading to outbreaks of illness among the weakened sisters. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and the years of recovery that followed, almost extinguished the nunnery of St. Anne. It was a crisis born not of human conflict or poor judgment, but of the unpredictable and overwhelming power of nature. It stripped them of their land's productivity, their animal wealth, and their very means of survival, leaving them impoverished and fighting for their continued existence in a world turned cold and unforgiving.